Bruce, which was a big old Jesuit college. They open a novitiate. They elect Stanislaus Czerniewicz. They have the congregation itself. A few years later, Catherine sends another delegation to Rome. At this point, it's public. The man who goes with the delegation tells the Pope what's going on up there, and the Pope, besides telling what else Catherine's doing, and the Pope simply says, probo, 3 times, publicly, verbally, not written, publicly, verbally. Well, what's he approving? He didn't say, he just says, probo. Is it what the guy has said to him? Is it the society? Is it what else Catherine's done? But it's enough to keep them going, a public verbal approbation. The kings, the Bourbon kings were furious, absolutely furious at that. The Pope writes to them and says, don't protest to Catherine, because, she's threatened that if you protest too much, she'll force all the Catholics, Latin Catholics, into the Russian Orthodox Church. And also, don't protest too much, because at the time they got furious at first, what else was going on? Remember, 1773 was the Suppression. 1776, it's on here, was the Declaration of Independence. We didn't get independence without a war. The war was between whom? The new colonies, the new country, supposedly, and Great Britain. Who really made it possible for us to get our independence? We don't like to admit it, but it was France. If they hadn't been with us, we would have had a hell of a time. The last thing, by the way, Russia and Britain had a treaty of commerce. The last thing the French wanted was for Russia to enter the American war for independence as an ally of Britain, even the thought of it. So they backed off from that too. As I said, this whole plot lacks all verisimilitude. It couldn't have happened, but it did. Meanwhile, we get to 1789 and the French Revolution. We're going to get eventually to the States. Questions? And no questions so far? Remember that the French Revolution came close to destroying the institutional structure of the church in Europe. It certainly destroyed all of those monarchs that had been urging the suppression and the abolition of the society. That made possible, in some ways, it made possible the restoration. But once it was clear the society was in existence up there in Russia, and it took a while for the rumors to get back and forth, and became clear that the Holy See was willing to have people not only join the society up there, geographically, but to join it canonically while living in other places. The former Jesuits, ex-Jesuits, often enough, they reconstituted themselves. For example, in 1803, the former English Jesuits, they petitioned the general up in Russia, can we join the society again? Which indeed they did. 1804 or so, a remnant of the few Old English Jesuits in the United States did the same kind of thing. And place after place after place did that in a partial restoration of the society, a partial restoration. Meanwhile, the general, of course, was up in Russia as the society gradually began to pick up a place here, place here, place here, and place here. At the end of the French Revolution, and remember the French Revolution wasn't just the guillotine chopping off heads while Madame Defarge knitted away in the Place de Concorde. And Darton said, it's a far, far better thing I do. No, the French Revolution went all the way from Spain to Russia. When it was over with, Pius VII, as his predecessor, had been in captivity under Napoleon, came back to Rome, determined right from the beginning to restore the Society of Jesus. As a matter of fact, he wanted to restore it on July 31st, 1814. For whatever reason, the papal scribes perhaps couldn't get the documents finished, but also there were some cardinals absolutely opposed to the restoration. But Pius insisted that it be restored, and insisted on a much more solemn document than the one that had suppressed it. So 1814, August 7th, the society was officially restored canonically in the entire world. But it was a very small group, not the 22,000 or so that had existed before the suppression. At the most, there may have been 600 Jesuits alive somewhere in the world at the time. Maybe. Many of them old people. This was 40 years from the beginning of the suppression to this point. Many of them old, many of them infirm, many of them who had gone through, in the European ones, completely gone through the French Revolution. And in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, had seen priests killed, nuns raped, churches burned, schools closed. And would you have embraced liberty, equality, fraternity? Hardly. So at the restoration of the society, first of all, because the church itself was extraordinarily conservative as a result of the revolution. And that's not blaming anybody, but that's all people can take only so much turmoil, and then they want order. And that's what people wanted at that time. So, the church was very conservative. The Society of Jesus was equally conservative out of the circumstances in which it had been suppressed, had barely hung on, and then came back again to life. Extraordinarily conservative. At the first general congregation, the one that elects generals, you'd expect peace, joy, love, concord, amity. They had two factions fighting as to how the society was going to live at its restoration. The general who had been living up in Russia, now general of the society, was not allowed to come to Rome, Father Brzezowski. When he died, they summoned a general congregation, and the Russian government threw all the Jesuits out of Russia. The congregation managed to get itself going. Two factions. One said, we should be the real, genuine article, the old society, just as it was, absolutely every way as it was. And the other saying, well, wait a minute, all kinds of things have happened from the revolution. We got to make changes in ourselves. You can understand both sides. The side that once said we wanted to be the old, genuine, real thing won out. And among the first things it said at the general congregation is, indeed, into full force and vigor come back the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, the spiritual exercises, all the decrees of all the previous general congregations, all the decisions of all the previous generals, all the old rules of the entire society, down to the rules for the people who took care of the kitchen and the stables. Everything supposedly was to come back into the ordinary circumstances. And out of that situation, through most of the 19th century, the Society of Jesus in Europe continued to be an extraordinarily conservative group, as the church in itself did. As somebody said, after the revolution, the nearest king precipitated himself into the hands or the arms of the nearest bishop. The two of them, the state and the church, were to support each other. And the society in Europe, more than any place else, was an extremely conservative group. What about the little group sitting up here in the United States? 1804, 1814, 1820, with the restoration of the society. What did we have here? Hardly a thing. We had the farms down in Maryland where we had worked for a long time. We had eventually one school founded by a man who had been an ex-Jesuit, John Carroll, who at the restoration of the society did not come back into the society because by that time he was elected bishop, first bishop in the United States, and he had founded a college, Georgetown College, 1789, the first one in the United States. That's basically what we started with. The farms, parish in Philadelphia, Georgetown College, a novitiate, not an awful lot more than that. And as we got started again in the United States, we faced a very hostile environment. Catholics at the time of the French Revolution were about 30,000 out of 3 million people in this country. 1%. They were regarded as followers of the whore of Babylon and the harlot of Rome. That kind of stuff was in textbooks, through public school textbooks, through the 19th century. With great suspicion we were looked upon. The church was, out of the whole experience of anti-Catholicism and anti-Jesuitism that came out of the English experience from the time of Elizabeth on. And given that kind of circumstance, you can understand the edginess with which the society got started again here. But we were not nearly as conservative as the European Jesuits were. First of all, because as a result of recurrent revolutions in Europe, French Revolution first, but then the revolution in 1820, the revolution in 1830, the revolution in 1848, groups of Jesuits from the provinces in Europe came to this country simply because they weren't allowed to stay over in their old country. Some of them went back eventually. But we faced problems in this country and circumstances no other group did. We were a mission country in the eyes of the church. The Church in the United States reported to the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the mission congregation, up until 1910, I think, in this country. And the society was no different. People in Rome had very little idea who we were, or rather where we were and what we were doing. One of the great things was the letter from one of the Roman Jesuits to another. What is happening to our poor novices in the place called the Midwest? I hear they are going to Dubuque in Mississippi. It gives you some idea what's happening. The first waves of people coming from Europe, first one really, was the group of Belgian young men in Belgium who had been recruited by Father Nerinx, the founder of the Congregation of Loretto in this country. He told them, you want to work with the Indians? I know where you go to work with the Indians. You go to the United States. They got to Maryland. They could hardly be supported there. They were going to be pitched out because they didn't have enough potatoes to feed the native United States novices. Deus ex machina, a snake oil salesman named Bishop de Bourg came and said, you want to go? I've got an Indian diocese out there on the other side of the Mississippi River. I'll give you land, and if you'll go out and found a school for the Indians. That's the beginning of the Missouri province, of which everything here, at one time the Missouri province was from the Appalachians to the Rockies and from the Gulf of Mexico almost up to the Canadian border. You take that land, start founding places. The first things that we were asked to do after the Restoration in Europe, and the first things that the bishops in this country asked us to do, and if we're at the service of the church, we are at the service of the bishops and others, and the first thing that lay people asked us to do was to found schools. This one came a little later, but among the very first, as I say, was the Georgetown one. Among the second oldest was St. Louis U. The bishop had founded a little academy in 1818. They couldn't possibly keep it going. They offered it to the Jesuits. The Indian school wasn't working because the whites were coming in hordes and displacing the Indians, even from a place like St. Louis, and they were moving farther west. He said, take my college, I'll give it to you, you can have it. 1828, we took it over. 1832, we got from the Missouri legislature a charter as a university. That, more than anything else, that kind of an institution, a college, was what both the bishops wanted, pastors wanted, people wanted in this country. But we faced circumstances that they never faced anyplace else in Europe. Even though the Revolution had really destroyed much of the old infrastructure, the 19th century was the period of the greatest number of people entering religious orders, the greatest number in seminaries, the greatest number of missionary orders, than any other previous 200-year period in the history of the church, as far as we know, all basically conservative. Here, though, they had to deal with, take one circumstance alone. Who's going to pay for the schools? It used to be that the king, or a bishop, or a lord, or a city council endowed the schools. The constitutions of the Society of Jesus says, in the law of the society, we may not charge tuition. Does that come as a revelation to some of you? Yeah. Finally, though, the Jesuits in St. Louis